Okay, good evening. Welcome to Halacha Shir. So this week's parsha is Parshas Vayikra, and the connection to the Sedra, the topic is salt on bread, something we're very familiar with, that we dip bread in salt on Shabbos meals, and we'll see that actually should extend beyond that. The connection to the parsha is from a pasuk in this week's Sedra, in Perek Beis, Pasuk Yud Gimel, the first box on the handout. If you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. The pasuk says, V'chol karban minchascha b'melach timlach. On every mincha offering you put salt. Al kol karboncha takriv melach. And there is salt on every single carbon. So there is an obligation, there is a mitzvah to put salt on every single carbon. And therefore it's a good springboard to discuss this topic of putting salt, dipping the challah in the salt or sprinkling it on top of it. And we'll see exactly the difference. It's based on a Gemara in Brachas. Brachas Daf Mem Amud Aleph. The Gemara says, Ein habitzea rishai livtzea. The person breaking the bread, making hamoitzi and cutting or breaking open the bread, should not do so at sheyaviu melach, until they bring salt, ay liftan, which Rashi explains means anything which is eaten with bread. So, it could be a dip, some olive oil or hummus or tchina or even some tuna or meat or fish or anything like that. Lifnei kol echad ve'echad, before each person. So you don't break bread until everyone has got something to dip the bread in. Tosfos says that it's not actually relevant anymore. Says Tosfos in the first opinion, "V'anu ein anu regilim lahavi ala shulchan lo melach v'lelifton." Nowadays, says Tosfos, writing many centuries ago, 900 years ago, let's say, we're not accustomed to do this. Mishum de pas shelanu chashuv, because our bread is chashuv. Back in the day, in the times of Chazal, you would have to dip the bread into something, into some sort of either salt or some sort of dip to give it flavor. But our bread is already salted and flavored and is choshev, and therefore it doesn't need it. So according to that reasoning of Tosfos, it wouldn't be necessary to do it. However, Tosfos continues and says, Miu Rabbi Menachem hoy medakdik ma'oid lahavi melach. Rabbi Menachem would be very particular to bring salt ala shulchan, to have it on the table, kad'isa b'medrash, as is brought in the medrash. And Tosfos quotes the medrash, Kashi Yisrael yeshvin ala shulchan, when the Jewish people are sitting at their table, umamtinin zeh, and they wait for each other ad sheyitlu yadayim, until they wash into the sedayim, v'heim below mitzvahs. They're sitting there quiet, they can't talk, they've washed, they haven't made hamoitzi yet. Hasotan mekatreg aleihem, the sotan accuses them and says, look at them, they're not doing anything, they're wasting their time. Or bris melach megin aleihen. And this covenant of salt protects Klal Yisrael. Now, we'll see what that means in Hashem in Parashat Shir. We're going to explore this a little bit further. But either way, there's a bris melach, there is a covenant, there is a pact with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which protects us, that even if Klal Yisrael are bereft of mitzvahs at that point, they're sitting not doing anything, the salt reminds us of Hashem's pact that Klal Yisrael lasts forever and is not going to destroy us. So that's what Tosfos says, and it's brought by the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah in the third box in Siman Kuf Samach Zayin says, "Issa b'medrash Yisrael yeshvin mamtin zeh zeh shifrei deyim v'heim below mitzvahs hasotim lekatreg." The sotim comes and accuses. What are they doing? They're not doing anything. Or bris melach megin aleihem. Now, the Shulchan Aruch, which opinion do we go with? According to the first opinion of Tosfos, it's not necessary to have salt. According to the second opinion, i.e. Rabbi Menachem, it is. So the Shulchan Aruch first quotes the first opinion of Tosfos. Lo yivtza sheyivu lefonav melach liftan, Pirish Rashi, dova hanechel mapas, the lafas beprus hapetzia, v'im hoya nekia, but if the bread is clean, good quality flour, in other words, oy shehi mutuveles betavenu b'melach, or it's already flavored with spices or with salt, ka'ein shelonu, like our bread nowadays, says the Shulchan Aruch, or if he chooses to eat bread unsalted, he's on a low salt diet, or he just likes it that way, then and he doesn't need to wait until salt is brought to him. So the Shulchan Aruch first brings that opinion of Tosfos, the first opinion of Tosfos. Then the Ramah, however, brings the second opinion of Tosfos. Umikol Malkum, says the Ramah, mitzvah lahaniach al kol shulchan melach kodim sheyivtza. There is a mitzvah to bring salt to the table, ki hashulchan doimeh lemizbeach, because our table where we eat is doimeh, is comparable to the mizbeach, va'achila karbon, and the eating is like having a carbon. V'nemal kol karbon chatakriv melach, in this week's Sedra, v'umegin min apronius, and it protects us from any danger. And therefore that is the minhag. What is it about? What is the simple understanding? So the Mishnah Berurah explains in the next box, that it's the idea is that you make a bracha of hamoitzi on tasty bread which is dipped in salt or with some sort of left on with some sort of relish, and therefore it's a covered for the bracha. So even though the Shulchan Aruch says that it's not really necessary, and certainly if you plan to have unsalted bread, you don't need to do that, because there's no lack of honor to the bracha. But the Ramah certainly adds that nevertheless the minhag is to have salt on the table, and that is the prevalent custom across the Jewish world. The Gemara, the concept of shulchan being like a mizbeach is based on the Gemara in Brachos. The Gemara in Brachos Nun Hey Amud Aleph says, "Kol zman shebeis hamikdash kayim mizbeach mechape al Yisrael." When there is a Beis Hamikdash, the mizbeach, the altar with karbonos, atones for the sins of Klal Yisrael. But nowadays, sadly, there's no Beis Hamikdash. Shulchan shel adam mechape lov. The shulchan of a person is mechape. Of course, that means by inviting guests and speaking divrei Torah, singing zmiros, that is mechape for a person in lieu of karbonos. Now, I think it's most common is people, I think, they sprinkle salt on the bread. They sprinkle salt on the bread, but that actually is not what the halacha says. Hello, welcome. There's some sheets here, but that is interestingly not the actual halacha. The halacha says, the Mishnah Berurah says that instead of just sprinkling salt on top of the challah, you should actually take the challah and dip it into the salt. The Mishnah Berurah says in the box number 5. That what you should do is cut the challah, and take a piece of the challah and dip it into the salt 3 times. Why? Says the Kaf HaChaim, the idea behind it is the shalish pa'amim shem havoya gematria melach. Interesting. The gematria of melach, which is the word for salt, is 78. Mem lamed ches, 40, 30, and 8, 78, which is the gematria of Yud K Vav K times 3. So Yud, a Hey, and Vav and a Hey is gematria 26. 26 times 3 is 78. And therefore, v'hu lahamtik hadin ki melach remez ledin. Because it's meant to sweeten the din, because melach is remez ledin. What does that mean? Salt is severe, is din. And therefore, what we want to do is take lechem, bread, which is chesed, and we overpower the severity of the salt with the chesed, the kindness of the bread. And therefore, we do that by taking the challah and we dip it into the salt 3 times, and then we eat it. Also, interestingly, the word, not only melach is 78, but the word for bread, lechem, is also 78. So therefore, 3 times Shem Hashem is a symbol that we overpower the severity, the din of salt with the chesed of bread. And the Aruch HaShulchan brings it as well. It's not just the Kaf HaChaim. He says, "Hamukubalim hesiru b'zeh." The Kabbalists warn us on this. Litbal prusas hamoitzi b'melach v'chein noagin kol yirei Elokim. Very powerful words. Anyone who has Yir Shamayim should do that as well. Should take the challah, the bread, and dip it into the salt 3 times. Interestingly, and I don't know quite. Another idea, by the way, is that the karbonos were sort of rolled in the salt rather than salt being sprinkled on them. So that also could explain, in sort of more practical terms, if we're mimicking the karbonos, that's why we don't just sprinkle the salt on it, but rather we dip it into the salt, aside from the Kabbalistic reasons just mentioned. Now, what's interesting, and I haven't got an answer to this, the dipping into salt seems to be applicable whenever you eat the bread, even during the week. But you don't see that so much. People do it on Shabbos. They're very particular to have the salt, and they dip, and they sprinkle on it, or whatever they do. But you don't really see it during the week. Why that is, I'm not entirely sure. It could be that during the week people are busy and they're rushing and they don't eat bread so much, or maybe they do. But on Shabbos, of course, there's a chiyuv to have a suda, and everyone has challah. Everyone has bread on Shabbos, and therefore maybe it's become sort of more common to do it on Shabbos. But the popular practice certainly seems to be that it's done during the Shabbos meals, but in halacha it should be every single meal. And I don't know why the custom doesn't seem to be more widespread during the week. Interestingly, I've got in the footnote, in the second note in paragraph 6, it's recorded that the Chasam Sofer's custom was to dip his bread into salt at every meal, with the exception of Friday night. It's right the opposite of what the common practice is. Everyone else around the Jewish world, they would dip it on Friday nights, but the Chasam Sofer would do it every meal, apart from Friday night. Why? Because that's the only time in the week when korbanos were actually not offered on the Mizbeach. Why? Because on other nights, korbanos were offered on that day, and if you didn't finish off during the day, you'll burn them on the Mizbeach through the night. But the korbanos that you did on Friday, you don't actually offer up on the Mizbeach on Friday night. You're not allowed to. No korbanos were put on the Mizbeach on Friday night. It's not Deicha Shabbos for korbanos that happened on Friday. And therefore, the Chasam Sofer's practice was dafka to dip during the week. It's interesting that that means he would wash presumably at every meal. We don't do that. We often, I know maybe some people do, but I know that Rabbi Pinchas Roberts' wife, when she was nifta some years ago, someone, I forget, there was a hesped at some point in the Adas, and one of the children said something very powerful. Maybe I read it about, I forget, that they said that she was makbid to wash twice a day. For lunch and for supper, breakfast and lunch, whatever it was. Why? She said because she has the opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah min Torah of Birchas Hamazon. Now, mitzvahs min Torah are not so easy to come by. So she wanted to fulfill a mitzvah midaraisa from the Torah. So she made sure she washed every single day, and she would bench and fulfill the mitzvah min Torah. I guess you've got to be that she was satiated with that. Anyway. Interestingly, also Rabbi Yashiv's daughter, who was married to Reb Chaim Kanievsky, also had a practice of washing every single day and making hamotzi, because she said she lived in Bnei Brak. Her father was in Yerushalayim. He rarely traveled. She rarely traveled, and she didn't see him very much. She saw him, from Pesach to Sukkot, even though they were living in the same country for an hour's journey away. But she didn't. She was there always for Reb Chaim, and Rabbi Yashiv very rarely traveled. But she felt that by washing and benching every day, she would say Horachmon Yivarech es Avi Meiri v'Imi Merasi, and she could do some form of kibbud aveim from a distance. Okay, just let's conclude with dipping the salt on Rosh Hashanah, just as an interesting final point. The Kitzur Shulchan Aruch says, "B'sudas halayla noagin lasos simonim l'shana tova." We know that on Rosh Hashanah we have honey on the table, and we dip into the honey. Tovin prusas hamoitzi b'dvash, says the Kitzur. V'achar she'ochel kazayis omi yirosen shechat zolin l'shana tova mesuka. We're familiar with that. V'achar kach tovel k'tzas tapuach mosuk b'dvash, and then we go dip a honey apple in the honey and mavorech b'proetz, etc. Now the halichas shlema, which is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, his halachic rulings and practices, says the following: the Mishnah Berurah also brings this, that we dip the challah into honey. V'chein noag Rabbeinu, and Rabbi Shlomo Zalman was known to do that as well. Litvesh b'dvash bilvad, to dip into honey. V'loi b'melach, and not with salt. That's always the question. Rosh Hashanah, do you need salt on the table? Do you need to dip the challah into the salt as well, or is it just honey? So he then says, Ach digdek lanicha lashulchan. So Rav Shlomo Zalman's practice was that he would only dip the challah into honey on Rosh Hashanah, not into salt, but he would have salt on the table. And he would do that on which meal? There's also a discussion around Rosh Hashanah time, how long do you have the honey for? To what point? So his practice was, B'sudas Rosh Hashanah, okay, Erev or Motzei Yom Kippur, when he would eat the Sudas HaMafsekes before Yom Kippur and the Suda after Yom Kippur, Leil Aleph the Sukkos, interestingly, just the first night of Sukkos, and Hoshana Rabbah and Shmini Atzeres. That was his practice. Now the Kaf HaChaim, the great Sephardi posek, the Ben Ish Chai, says, Minhag Ashkenaz matbinim prusas hapatzia b'dvash. He says the Ashkenaz practice is to dip the challah into honey on Rosh Hashanah, to say Tehei Shana Habo Aleinu Mesuka V'Toiva Lonu, etc. V'Atzol Gam B'Sfarad Yesh Nagim Kein Lesim Toivin. We Sfaradim do the same. V'Hainu Shemazminin Kli Sheyesh Boi Dvash Oy Sukar Ala Shulchan. So if you've been to a Sephardi home on Rosh Hashanah, and I've seen this, that many homes have not honey, but they have a bowl of sugar, and they dip the challah into sugar. And then they dip into salt as well 3 times, as mentioned above. So you got sweet and savory. Let's say you've got the challah in salt and in honey, according to the Kaf HaChaim. And then he says in the last paragraph, "V'chein yaseh b'tzuz shachris u'belal sheni u'machrosei avelo yitabel b'dvash levad bilti melach tchila mishum the tibel chatichas amoyzi melach hu lematek hadgvuros," as we said. So you don't want to give up on that. You want to always make sure that you have chesed overpowering din, as discussed, and then you don't want to give up on that, and then you also want to have a siman tov, so you do the honey as well. So that's just an interesting aside. So just to summarize some of the main ideas, the connection to this week's Sedra is al kol karbon chot kriv melach, and therefore there is an idea that our shulchan is like the mizbeach. The Gemara in Bracha says that you shouldn't make hamotzi until you brought salt. The first opinion in Tosfos is that it's not necessary, it's not relevant nowadays because our bread is salted and spiced and tasty and it's considered an honor for the bracha, and therefore you don't need to add anything to it. However, Tosfos brings a second opinion, Rabbi Menachem, who is medakdek ma'oid, to put salt on the table. It's a bris melach, it's megin, whilst Klal Yisrael are sitting quietly, bereft of mitzvahs. And it reminds us of our pact with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that our connection lasts forever, etc. Just to finish the summary, the idea is that we dip 3 times into the salt rather than sprinkle the salt on it. We dip 3 times, and the idea is al pi Kabbalah that the din is meant to be overpowered by the chesed of the bread, and the gematria of lechem or of melach is 78, and that is sort of rebutted by the gematria of Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, which is times 3 is 78, 26 times 3. Okay, Peseda, we'll leave it there.